Long ago, before humanity had risen from the soils of evolution, there was a very different species out in the cosmos. A species that would one day bring about horrific and immoral experiments that would give rise to an entity that would bring about their own destruction and near extinction. Out there, in an unknown dimension, a civilization had been constructed by an alien race, only known as the Otherworlders, a species that possessed the appearance and shape humans would have, but came with a distinct blue hue draping over their skin, and a mind that rivaled that of our own gods, allowing them to construct unbelievable feats in the technological race. However, like the tale of the tortoise and the hare, it's not the quickest that will succeed, but the arrogance that comes with it, that ultimately becomes their end. Before that time, however, there was one that sought to rally the divided race into a single dominant force. This individual had been known as Yunea. She soon became a political and royal figure in the head of the species, allowing for her to create the Yunea dynasty. Over a great deal of time, the dynasty had stretched out into a sovereign empire, with the alchemists and scientists of their race creating technology that looked ancient and magical, but was eons ahead of the modern-day human race's technological sphere. Through this, the Otherworlders had built machinery to suit their purposes, similar to how our race had done so with factories and power plants. However, to power these mechanisms, the Otherworlders would tame the natural power of their world by utilizing the many lightning storms. The Otherworlders soon began research into creating new sources of power, as the lightning had served their purpose for now, but they would need something more reliable. This is where the research began into creating the Orbs, which soon turned to research in vitae, which had been the energy that is secreted in the blood of mammals when under a great deal of stress. While the alchemists had been studying these new methods, others had been developing interdimensional travel, allowing them to traverse new worlds, either to expand their empire or to develop it further. Eventually, they would capture great beasts and experiment on them to gather more vitae, in order to power their civilization. The Otherworlders had stored these energies with the use of laid-in jars, ready to be used later in time. Soon the alchemists led by Temeku had constructed the orbs that had been spheres of great power, and soon they would use one to power a portal into a different realm. All seemed to be going to plan. Nothing out of the ordinary. That was until a sludge-like creature had come through the mystical doorway, a reddish slime that stained everything it touched, creating more and more of itself, expanding its mass, and on top of that, it was incredibly hostile towards any other race. The alchemists, shocked by this event, cut the power to the portal and had sealed the creature away, to be studied out of curiosity. However, as we all know, it was curiosity that killed the cat. The alchemists had dubbed the creature as the Shadow, and they soon saw that this crimson slime had been attracted to the orbs. Tamaku's subordinate would be soon placed in charge of the research of the shadow creature. Meanwhile, the Otherworlders had found the world of Earth and discovered our species, pulling our kind into their cavernous world of blue lights and green hues, to which the Otherworlders had found that humanity would not go down without a fight, with many of them being slain by the early forms of humans. This had led into transforming what humans they captured into creatures known as the ghouls. They did this by treating the captured humans with their waters. As soon as the waters had touched their lips and flowed down their throats, the transformation would soon begin, with black tendrils creeping under the skin and around the temples of the skull, and then penetrating the eyes with blood flowing down their cheeks like tears. The growth of these black tendrils would be fueled by negative emotions such as fear, anguish, and pain. The Otherworlders would then transport these newly formed monsters to the hunting grounds to be trained by Karangai. Eventually, these ghouls would return to the human settlements and would drag the humans kicking and screaming back to the dark Otherworld to be tortured and experimented on to drain the precious vitae. Eventually, the screams and anguish that could be heard throughout the industrial estates of the Otherworld civilization, a rogue division of their race would begin to plot against the current Empress, Atue, in order to stop the vicious experiments on those who had done nothing to them, and sought a way to end the bloodshed. At this time, Tamaku's subordinate, Kita, had been devising a way to pull the properties of the shadow out and to develop a formula as the shadow feasted on organic properties and energies, and so the rebels could use it to dismantle the vitae extracting operations and end the immoral experimentation once and for all. During these events, however, Empress Atue had been in labor and soon gave birth to her heir, who would be named Tahana. However, something was terribly wrong. The child had contracted a disease. The doctors found only a single way to save her life, but the cost was too great. But Atue did not care. Out of some maternal instinct, she would sacrifice herself for the bloodline, allowing the doctors to perform the surgery required to save Tahana's life. Though Tahana had been spared from the disease, she had been left very weak and needed a huge supply of vitae in order to survive each day. Tahana would soon be crowned as the next empress, with the several orbs circulating her as the ceremony was conducted. Over the years, several princes of Otherworlders would try their charms and court the young empress. However, she found none to be worthy of her time, and so they were all dismissed. Tahana had still been bitter about the surgery to save her life, which led to her mother's death, and on top of that, it had in fact made her infertile, which had been dire news to the future of the bloodline, and the population of Otherworld had mourned for their new empress. All but the division that had secretly plotted against the dynasty. At this time, the newly formed dimensional gates had been constructed, and several Otherworlders had been contracted to go through these gates and to begin construction of the temples in these worlds, to expand on their empire and scientific research. Empress Tahana would be warned about an insurrection forming within their civilization, and she would advise that military action should be taken against the enkindled fortress. Over the years and moving into the 4th century of Earth, the Tomb of Tin Hynen had been constructed, where the Otherworlders had brought one of the orbs with them and stored it on Earth. Moving further through the timeline, Alexander would be brought to justice before the Empress herself. His crimes are unknown, but the Empress had been so angered, so much so that she sought pleasure in exiling the Otherworlder to Earth, to live in a human form, and so, as she wished it, it had been done. However, this, in the grand scheme of things, would be a blessing in disguise, as the rebel force had been visited by Kita, who gave them the formula to solve their issues. However, little did they know it would carve a path of more bloodshed. They would plan and carry out an assassination attempt of Empress Tahana, which ultimately failed, but they had sabotaged the orbs, which unexpectedly caused a chain reaction that would travel all the way to the Great Gates and to the center of their empire's civilization, resulting in their destruction. Kita's colleagues then transform into the wraiths that would patrol the ruins of the Otherworld. The sabotage, however, hadn't been as successful as they would have hoped. The one Kita had entrusted with the formula would be crushed by falling debris inside the lower factory before they could infect the entire system with the formula. Back on Earth, in Algeria, the portal leading to the Otherworld had been affected by the chain reaction, and was distorting. Somehow, to the otherworld's shock and horror, something slithered through the distorted portal. The shadow had managed to escape captivity, and part of it had found its way to Earth, where several of the orbs had been contained. Back in the destroyed civilization of the otherworld, the remainder of the shadow feasted on the civilians, spreading through the lands and scarred the world with its mass. Kaita, however, had survived the ordeal. However, he would use the supply of the Vitae in order to keep himself alive, but continued to plan a new way to end the bloodshed. Locked within their crumbling civilization, Kita believed himself to be a traitor of his race and had begged for forgiveness from all he had destroyed due to his actions. Welcome to the complete history and story of Amnesia. In the late 15th century, in 1486, Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa had been born. 29 years later, moving into the 16th century, Johann Weyer had been born. 10 years later, at the age of 39, Heinrich travels to the small town of Altstadt in Prussia, where he remained for a fortnight. While exploring the town in his journey, he discovers the underground Mithraic temple. Walking through the dark tunnels and catacombs, he came to a central chamber where he discovers an orb, where he would go over to pick up the orb and begins carrying it away from the pedestal it had been laid on prior to his visit. Little did he know at this time though, the orb had a guardian, the Shadow, and that stealing the orb had branded him a target that must be dealt with. Heinrich would see the demonic bloodied slime that began to move towards him at frightening speeds. He would think that traveling back to the surface of the light would bring salvation to him, but sadly he would be wrong, as the Shadow stalked him throughout the town, across the Alps, and eventually caught up to him, and in his panic he drops the orb, allowing the Shadow to reclaim it, taking it away from the Alps and back to its resting place. Four years after this event, at the age of 14, Johann became the student of Heinrich Agrippa, where he would study the orbs under his direction and with the other arcane arts in the world. During his studies, Johann would learn how to harness and control the power and capabilities of the orb. Throughout his life, however, he had managed to find and gather several of the orbs without alerting the presence of the Shadow, or so he thought. Over the following 29 years, Johann gathered several of the orbs he could find, until learning of one that is located deep below a church within its catacombs, in a French city known as Calais. In the events of With the Blessing of a King, with the help of 3 French soldiers, Johann had descended down the tight and claustrophobic tunnels of the catacombs and had managed to pick up the latest orb to stir his curiosity. But as previously spoken about, it is curiosity that often leads to death. And that would be exactly that, when the Shadow comes out from the darkness, killing the 2 soldiers that accompanied Johann in his journey. Terrified at the sheer sight of the creature, Johann flees back to the surface and manages to escape the world-bending entity. The orb that he had collected that night had been the star-shaped soapstone. During these times, the castle of Brennenburg had fallen due to a fire that consumed all in its path. Just like the Shadow, This is where Alexander had come back into the picture and rebuilds the castle from the ground up, and soon uses the stronghold as his primary base of operations. Utilizing his human disguise, he had masqueraded as a Prussian baron, where he would tell the civilians that he had originally come from Rhineland and lived in a castle where his family awaited for his safe return. Eventually, Alexander comes into contact with Johann and Agrippa. With their assistance, the three of them would travel to the temple beneath the Prussian woods, and together they would recover another orb. Inside the laboratories of Brennenburg Castle, Alexander had attempted to create vitae artificially. However, after several attempts failed, he knew that he would have to gather what was needed for his work. He knew he had to do the unthinkable. These attempts, however, did give rise to a dangerous set of fumes which began to damage other unstable ingredients, which forces him to move these to the wine cellar. In 1618, the events of the 30-Year War had broken free, causing all of Europe to move against each other in a saga of bloody conflicts, all stemming from the crowning of Frederick V of the Palatinate, or as many had called him at the time, the Winter's King. During the long and horrifying war, many disasters rocked the nations that populated Europe, with disease and famine being among them. During these times, Alexander had caught many of his men leaving their posts and abandoning them altogether, to which he would whisk them away back to Brennenburg Castle to be experimented on, tortured, and given new life as his loyal servants, or as their new name would suggest, his gatherers, with those being the grunts and brutes that would often patrol the castle, which gave rise to a folklore about them within the local towns and populace. In the middle of the 17th century, 12 years into the wars, a fort had been constructed in the Algerian desert by the Ottoman commander, to which it had been named as Al-Mamaru. 10 years after the wars had concluded, in 1658, following in his people's footsteps, Alexander began experimenting on animals to gather the necessary vitae for his plan to return to the otherworld in order for it to succeed. Alexander had found another dead end, however, as the plan was unsuccessful and yielded nothing. He then realizes that if he is to return to his own world, then he would have no choice but to torture the vitae straight out of the human blood supply pumping through their veins. By 1670, Wilhelm von Gierich had been born into the House of Gierich. 31 years later, moving into the early period of the 18th century in 1701, the Order of the Black Eagle had been founded with the help of one Alexander. Wilhelm would then, at the age of 32, sign a contract within the inner sanctum of the order to gain Alexander's recommendation at the Prussian royal court, to which the contract would last for the next 3 years of his life, where Wilhelm would conduct himself and make 39 arrests between 1702 and the late summer of 1704, bringing them into the dank and dark dungeons of Brennenburg Castle deep beneath the grounds, with only the fellow screams and cries of the other prisoners to keep them company, along with the occasional rat that festered through the cracks of the brickwork. Over 100 civilians, however, would be brought in too to be tortured, beaten, and brought near to death in order for Alexander to gather the necessary vitae used for his way home. The following year, a fire breaks out south of Alpstead, which ends with the death of one unknown individual. However, in the last case, Wilhelm had investigated into this, and he found the culprit and arrested Emil for arson, escorting him back to the castle. However, Alexander isn't pleased with Wilhelm and his men for their imprudent behavior. Alexander leads the men and Wilhelm into the wine cellar, to which he locks them inside after poisoning the food and wine served to them, which had a very disturbing effect on their anatomies, twisting their bones and turning them into new gatherers, all under Alexander's influence.
What's happening? Oh, it feels like my chest is going to burst. my God! Wilhelm, do something!
Accept it. We're not getting out of here alive.
How can you say that? Alexander, you piece of shit! Let us out of here!
Soon a sheriff had been sent from Königsberg in order to question Wilhelm about the recent civil arrests. However, once he had arrived, he found the man nowhere to be seen and believed that Wilhelm had been discharged and he would return to Königsberg in the late winter, reporting that the crime rate had dropped significantly. In 1718, daughter of Dorothea Stoss, Anna had been married into the family of Koch, where she would relocate from Olmsted to Königsberg. 56 years later, in 1774, the events of House of Girick would take place, where Klaus Gottskall had tried his hand at investigating into the disappearance of Wilhelm, which takes him back to the barn fire in 1704. After searching the farm for clues, his pursuit would take him to a church within Olmsted, where he had combed through the records and steered his attention towards Königsberg, where Anna Koch had lived, who was a witness to the arson attack on the barn. Soon he would meet with Anna, who confirms all that has been told to him and enlightens him to more details about that event, that the farmhand had fallen asleep next to a lamp and knocked it over in the process which caused the fire to spread. After leaving Anna, he would take a new direction in his travels to confront a certain baron going by the name of Alexander at the castle of Brennenburg, where Klaus would disappear, never to have been heard from again, as he pushed his way through the gates of the stronghold. While opening the new sewers within Brennenburg, the men discover a poisonous fungi that caused a plague to spread among Alexander's men and the prisoners, which corrupted the vitae that had been extracted from the recent tortured prisoners, which significantly slows down the process of creating a traveler's locket. Alexander would then pursue means to create a vaccine in order to combat the plague, so that the process wouldn't be interrupted any further, allowing the extraction process to continue without any of the vitae to be further corrupted. In 1799, Alexander had finished building a rough version of the Traveler's Locket with the help of Agrippa and Johann, which reinforced his desire to see other world again, and in order to find his beloved. Once the ceremony had started and the portal had opened up in the orb chamber, finally the end to his quest was in hand. All Alexander must do now was to pass through the portal and take his rightful place and find his beloved. However, it wasn't meant to be, as Johann had thrown himself through the portal, which deeply angered Alexander, as the portal had only enough energy for one to travel to the other side. Alexander, in his anger, turned against Agrippa, trapping him inside a dead husk. Johann would claim that he was trying to revoke the banishment against Alexander, but refused to help him unless he released Agrippa. Johann sends through a recipe for a tonic that could help his master, but Alexander decides not to help, as Agrippa is his only connection with the other world now. Alexander here attempts to conduct another ritual to open a new portal to the other world, but the strain on the orb appeared too great as it shattered into 6 pieces, and Alexander was forced to start from the beginning all over again. Moving into the 19th century, Daniel had been born, growing up in Canterbury, Kent, within the United Kingdom. Later in his life, however, he would move to Mayfair, London, due to constantly being the target of his abusive father. Earlier in his life, he also found that school life wouldn't be as safe as he thought, as he had been bullied relentlessly. In 1824, Daniel's little sister Hazel would be born. 4 years later, Justine Flaubel had been born, and soon her mother, Madeline, had died in labor while trying to give birth to her brother. In the same year as these events, The Madness Processing Company had also been established. After these events, unfortunately, Hazel had been diagnosed with a dangerous disease by Dr. Tate, who didn't expect her to live past the age of 12, forcing her to remain in bed all year round, even during the summer season. Daniel, after helping his father with work, would read to his little sister with the books in his collection. During his school days, Daniel had found the courage within to overcome the fear he had in order to stand up to the bully that ruled his life, Henry Bedloe. In the heat of the fight, Daniel had picked up a rock and smacked him across the face with it. After this incident, he would be worried that Henry would come to his house in search for him to reclaim the power he had over him in the schoolyard. In 1836, Justine had been exposed to a series of tests and experiments in order for her father to gain an understanding of her mental disorder, which incidentally isolates her from her only friend Clarice, making her childhood a very lonely one, and 2 years later her father would abuse Justine in many sexual ways. Out of the darkness and into the light of 1839, a miracle had occurred. Hazel had turned 15, living 3 years longer than the expectancy. With her parents physically and mentally drained, however, they decided to take her to the hospice in Canterbury, where she would stay there permanently. Just before she left, however, she would give Daniel a hug goodbye before wishing him luck on his journey through Algeria, to which she had referred to it as a grand adventure, which she wouldn't be wrong. On the 12th of January, Herbert would write a letter to Justine's father asking about his daughter's treatments and how they were doing. However, the true purpose of the letter would be made clear to the father, as Herbert wanted them to vouch for him to increase his chances of getting into Algeria. However, a twist of fate would happen on the 2nd of February, or a twist of a knife, where Justine murders her father with the star-shaped stone that had been attached to Herbert's letter. With her father gone and no other heirs being readily available, Justine had inherited the entire wealth and estate to the Florbel family. Over the course of the next month, Daniel and Herbert had met up, and on the 14th of May, the two had arrived in Algeria, hoping to study the tomb of Tinhanen. The following day, the events of Old Friends had begun, where Herbert meets up with his old friend Faraj, where he gives Herbert Johan's map of the tomb. Just then, his friend is killed in front of him, along with his nephew, Bacai, by Captain Ambrose of the French army, who was sent to quell the recent rebellion brewing. This forced Herbert to retreat back to the hotel to seek refuge with Daniel. Strangely enough, however, General Ambrose had gone there to give the pair a star-shaped stone. With this in hand, the pair traveled the following morning to the tomb with their caravan, and eventually they reach the tomb, but they soon see that it had taken them all day to reach the tomb, and night began to fall upon them with the sun setting, so they sought refuge within the nearby fort Al-Mamaru. The next day, on the 17th of May, Daniel had taken a couple of men with him into the tomb before suddenly becoming trapped, but just before being freed by his company, he managed to find the pieces to an orb which had branded him by the shadow. Once he had taken the pieces out of the tomb with him, visibly injured by the accident, Herbert arranges for Daniel to be sent back to London. On the ship traveling to London, Daniel had fallen overboard and had caught a glimpse of the shadow stalking him within the waters. Minutes later, he had been rescued by another ship that was approaching Portugal. All the while Daniel had been experiencing this, the shadow had been busy moving towards Herbert's camp, which creeps towards the men, where they had been talking, laughing and reminiscing about past events, a warm moment that had soon been turned into terror when the shadow attacked the men viciously, absorbing them into its mass and ripping them apart. Herbert then sends Abdullah back to the Algiers to contact the French. Realizing that he was being hunted by the shadow, Herbert runs through the desert, which makes him delirious, believing to have seen Algiers in the distance, but through the eyes of Abdullah. Being chased by the shadow, Abdullah had received minor injuries from the terrifying monster. and had alerted the French, who sent multiple search parties out into the desert to search for the missing men. Herbert at this time too had been hunted by the shadow, until finding a dark spot in the desert. Moving towards it, he soon realized it had been a cave and traveled inside, where he soon traveled to the other world to escape the shadow's hunt. While in Otherworld, he attempted to find a way back to his own, to no avail, and eventually died due to dehydration and starvation. All the French parties could find had been several footprints in the sand, along with the camp completely deserted. The men had seemed to have vanished without a trace. The following month, on the 22nd of June, Daniel had arrived back in London with his injuries being tended to while home. He had attempted to fix the orb, but he found he could not. 3 days later, he visited a geologist in order to find out more about the orb's nature. The geologist attempted to study the pieces but found nothing about it, other than it had to have been made by a completely different world. Just when he found himself at a dead end, he soon received a letter on the 2nd of June from the Algerian office, who detailed the horrific events being retold to them about the shadow. But Daniel could not make sense of these ramblings. After looking through Herbert's journal that he had gotten from the nearby customs house, he saw that Herbert had retrieved a different orb, and madness had spread amongst the men, which made him question if the pieces he found were an orb at all, or if he had just imagined everything. The following night, Daniel had awakened from a terrifying nightmare. In an effort to comfort himself, he got up and somehow manages to restore the orb, fusing the pieces together. On the 5th of July, Daniel paid a visit to a university to research about information in relevance to the orbs in order to understand what he had in his possession. Daniel, while reading up on the orbs, overhears that the geologist he previously visited about the orb had been mysteriously murdered. The shadow had been following Daniel and was getting closer to him and the orb, killing those who have interacted with the artifact. Throughout the following days, Daniel would send several letters to people he thought would be able to help with his predicament, with one being addressed to Justine. However, she wouldn't reply to this request. The end for Daniel had seemed to have been drawing near, with the scent of the shadow drawing closer to his senses, until 14th of July, Daniel receives a letter urging him to travel to his location. The letter had been a reply from Alexander, who sent instructions to come to the castle Brennenburg. Before planning the journey to Brennenburg, Daniel travels back to his hometown, Canterbury, and visited a physician to talk about his nightmares, which had been caused by the shadow stalking him. He soon found that everyone who had been in contact with him in the physical sense had mysteriously died or had been murdered, and knew that something was after him. The ramblings sent to him in that letter from Algeria all began to make sense now. This is where he packs his bags and begins traveling to Brennenburg Castle. After arriving in the city Bremen, Daniel arranges travel with a carriage to take him to the castle, but the driver had refused the journey. But after being given more money, the man soon accepts the deal. But another man known as Gabriel would accompany him, who had been an outrider, which takes us into the events of the Outrider. Arriving at the village of Altstadt, which had been his last stop before his eventual meeting with Alexander at the Brennenburg Castle. Taking on the advice of Gabriel, the Outrider, Daniel stays at the local inn before heading out in the morning. Later that night, however, a mysterious cloaked individual that appeared like a shadow in the night steals a cat, knocking the young inn-worker out. Gabriel, who sees the Night Raider, gives chase to the creature and ends the chase with his rifle, shooting the cloaked individual in the back, and rescues the cat, Tinker. There the creature runs away down into a cave, where Gabriel gives chase once again, only then to be grabbed and attacked within the darkness. Using his lantern, the Outrider smashes it over the creature, which sets it ablaze as the shadowy figure burns in the darkness with the flames illuminating the cavern walls. Gabriel flees back to the inn. The following morning, on the 3rd of August, the creature hadn't been seen after that. Daniel and Gabriel soon depart to Brennenburg Castle, where they meet the Baron, Alexander, who sees Daniel to his guest room located in the back hall. During his time in this accommodation, however, Daniel would continue to be haunted by more horrific nightmares while he slept, all stemming from the shadow that had been in swift pursuit of him. The next day, Alexander tells Daniel that he knows of the shadow, that it is a guardian of the orb, and kills anyone who comes into contact with it, in its mission to reclaim what has been taken. 3 days later, Alexander and Daniel begin to work together in order to banish the shadow from this world. On the 8th of August, Alexander manages to channel the orb's power onto Daniel and himself, but would be interrupted when discovering that the shadow had been closer to them than previously thought. To buy themselves more time, on the following day, the two execute a prisoner in order to conduct a warding ritual. Throughout the next 7 days, Daniel continued to torture and execute more prisoners to conduct more warding rituals in an effort to keep the shadow at bay, justifying this as doing the world a favor, seeming as under Alexander's influence, Daniel believed the prisoners all to be bad people who were beyond such things as redemption. On the 18th of August, the events of Waiting for the Rain would occur within the graveyard of Oldstad, where a family mourns the death of their only son. In the grief of the father, Gustav Zimmermann says that one of the daughters would have served better in death than the son. This leads one of the daughters, Elise, to escape from her grief-stricken family, running away with a young errand boy at the local inn, who had been Jacob, as previously seen in The Outrider. She manages to flee the farmland, but her absence is soon discovered by her abusive father, who hunts and captures her, intending on murdering her. However, in a strange turn of events, he suddenly returns to reason, allowing her to run down the dirt road, to which she sees a carriage coming towards her when she had believed it to be her only salvation from this nightmare. But she would soon know that the carriage had come for her and her family, to transport them all to a completely new nightmare, one that ended in certain death after being pulped and tortured, as this carriage had carried both Daniel and Alexander. Later that night, one of the daughters manages to break the floor of their cell, allowing for a small hole to be made, leading into a tunnel to which the smallest of the daughters is able to escape with one mission: to alert the town's guard in light of this injustice. However, Daniel soon discovers this, tracking her down to the storage room, and then proceeds to brutally murder her, believing what Alexander had told him about these people, that these were murderers and had even conducted more heinous crimes than thought imaginable. This was enough to convince his conscience, that he was in the right for giving them death and keeping their operations secret. The death of this little girl, however, stains Daniel's mind, which cripples him, and Alexander begins to suspect that he cannot trust Daniel anymore. So he barricades himself inside the inner sanctum, where he begins to conduct the final ritual in order to escape this world and back to his home, the other world. The following day, on the 19th of August, Daniel discovers that he had been manipulated by Alexander. Lost and guilt-ridden from all of what he has done, he begins to sabotage the elevator leading down to the dungeons. He creates a potion that would erase all the memories of his past work, due to being unable to move past his horrific deeds in his own self-preservation. He then drinks the potion and begins writing himself a note to find and kill Alexander in the inner sanctum before he can succeed in his plans. Stumbling into the rainy hall, he begins to feel dizzy, muttering his name, his hometown, and the fact of his pursuer, the Shadow, over and over again, all the while losing his memories with each utter of the phrasing, losing a bit of it in the translation like Chinese whispers. He eventually collapses and falls unconscious. Soon, however, with the rainwater leaking onto his face, he reawakens Hearing the thunder outside, he picks himself up and eventually finds the note his previous self had left for him, beginning the events of Daniel's dark descent. Throughout Daniel's quest in unlocking his memories and to find Alexander in the inner sanctum, he is met by the shadow that is described to him as a living nightmare. Each area of the castle gives him a little glimpse into his lost memory of the relationship between him and Alexander, that the two had a partnership of some kind, and that betrayal had set the two on different paths. Suddenly he sees that the shadow had cornered him, but by using the laboratory, he devised an acid to burn the creature away, allowing him to descend deeper into the castle until coming to a new challenge that floods the area, and now he is pursued by a stalker within the waters. After rushing through the waters, he comes to the area he once called a home to him, where he is able to assemble the parts to fix the elevator and to descend even deeper into the darkness. All the while, the reality-bending nightmare pursuing him continues its relentless assault. His journey was anything but easy, however, as it wasn't just the shadow haunting him, he was also having to contend with the gatherers who hunted him to keep their master Alexander safe, and Daniel's mind would be stricken with the case of nyctophobia that caused him to have hallucinations from time to time that would bring him to the brink of insanity. After traveling deeper and deeper down the castle's locations and various functions and escaping from immense dangers lurking around every corner, he eventually meets someone who can help him in his quest, Agrippa. He tells Daniel of the recipe for the tonic to free him of the husk that he is bound within, and of the 6 pieces of the orb that Alexander had used to torture more prisoners, as the orbs leaked madness onto those around the shards. However, upon making his way up to the bridges above the areas previously explored in his hunt for the orb pieces, he is contacted by Alexander, telepathically telling him that he has gone too far and that he must be stopped. Suddenly he is jumped by 3 of the gatherers present and is taken to the dungeons there. Alexander then advises Daniel that he should remain in the prisons and await for the shadow to embrace him. But Daniel refuses and escapes with the shadow in hot pursuit. There wasn't much time left for him. He finds Agrippa and frees him from the husk by feeding him the tonic and slicing off his head without killing him, taking Agrippa along for the descent into the inner sanctum, to which Daniel is constantly harassed by the shadow. But through perseverance, he is able to gain access to the orb chamber, where Alexander had been minutes away from escaping this world. Here Alexander feels threatened by Daniel's presence, but continues the ritual, with Daniel posing no interference as the portal opens, and Alexander believing that Daniel is here to see him off. He tells him his sacrifice would not be forgotten as he begins to levitate towards the opening, when all of a sudden Daniel throws Agrippa's head into the portal, allowing for his soul to be reunited with Johann. This greatly angers Alexander to no end, but it was the end, not just for Daniel, but for him as well, as the shadow had broken through the final defense and had flooded the orb chamber, claiming the 2 souls trapped there. As Daniel embraces the shadow after seeing Alexander be consumed by the living nightmare, his soul is thrusted into the void, as the castle had been too consumed by the mass and collapses in on itself as the shadow leveled the structure. With Daniel's spirit trapped in the void, Agrippa pleads with Johann to take pity on the man branded by the Guardian and find a way to save him. Johann agrees, and Agrippa ensures Daniel that everything will be alright. The creatures that had been dwelling within the waters of the castle, however, had been the only ones of their kind, and after the castle was leveled, the race had gone extinct. In 1854 to 1856, the ruins of the castle had been excavated by the Old England Historical Society and the University of Königsberg. There they unearthed several items of interest, which they split between the two organizations. However, the OEH Society ends up in a legal dispute with the university for the custody of the orb in the Prussian state. The university eventually wins the dispute, and the OEH Society is forbidden from shipping the goods to London. Soon after this event, an individual had broken into the university and stolen up to 4,000 pages of material found in the ruins of Brennenburg. The authorities eventually recover a fraction of the materials in a pattern of suicides among the wealthiest parties, leading them to speculate that most of the materials had been spread among the wealthy collectors of France. The history of Brennenburg becomes increasingly difficult to study as the Alexandrians of Amiens and the Church of Hainan of Calais begin to move into the situation, which gives rise to a myth that Alexander was a vampire. However, most of the records had debunked these claims, as they speak of the Baron of Brennenburg consisting of nothing more than a long line of treasurers and statesmen. On the 18th of March, 1858, Mario de Vigny, who had been a famous violinist, shows up to a performance drunk, so drunk in fact that he collapses on stage. But just as fate would have it, Justine had been there to save him from the embarrassment. With the help of her two lovers, Basile Gairoux and Alois Racine, he is carried off the stage. A month later, on the 22nd of April, Alois's father writes to Inspector Marot, worried about his son's relationship with Justine, asking the inspector to take Dr. Victor Fournier to confront Justine and to diagnose her as being hysterical as to incarcerate her legally. The father was right to worry, as something in her childhood had darkened Justine's heart, something abusive with her father that changed her, so much so that she turned into a psychotic individual who wanted those she, quote-unquote, loved to play her sinister games. And this was more prevalent when she had tied her former lover Basile up, drugged him with absinthe, before tearing out his eyes and making him the first of the suitors that would patrol the dungeons beneath her estate, to which she called her playground the Cabinet of Perturbation. Throughout the remainder of the year, she would lock up more men she loved down there, after they had turned into more suitors, making the toll become free. Alois Racine had developed a self-destructive fixation with Justine, while Basil had become enraged by her for blinding him, swearing that if he ever gets his hands on her, he will kill her. As she joyfully skips back to the safety of her own estate. However, the fate of the violinist was to be her new plaything down there in the cabinet, being tied up and tortured for her own amusement, driving him completely insane after being drugged and tortured for so long. It can have a very devastating effect on the human mind. In 1859, Inspector Marriott, Dr. Victor Fournier, and Father Hector David are all kidnapped by Justine and are placed deep inside the cabinet. She places them all in torture devices to add to the many screams of torment echoing throughout the dungeons. This is where the events of Amnesia Justine takes place, with the woman in question recording her voice on many of the phonographs hidden down there. To explain the situation, she releases the suitors, trapping herself in a cell, and voluntarily overdoses on lithium to induce a temporary state of amnesia. After blacking out, she soon awakens to find a suitor in front of her cell. If he still had his eyes, then it would be as if he had been staring down at her. After walking away from the cell, Justine makes her way through the cabinet, while either saving or killing these prisoners to make her escape. If she chose to kill the prisoners, then she would have an easier time of escaping. However, if she chose to save them, then she would be putting her own survival at risk. However, she soon reaches the final test of the game, where the walls begin to crush her form, until they slowly move back to the starting position, where Justine claims that this had been the best one yet.
This was the best one yet. So elaborate. It's just too much. Enough of this. Get up, Justine.
Well done, child. God be praised. You have saved us, child. Open the door. Hey, you! Almost free. Come on, get us out of here!
It's already locked, but you can never be too certain. I really should keep this door locked.
Mademoiselle Justine, are you down there? Is everything all right?
Of course, Clarice, I'm quite all right.
Soon after this event took place, Oswald Manders had been born into a wealthy English family. The Manders family owned the Manders Processing Company, which specialized in industrial meat processing. They owned a massive factory, possibly the largest of its kind in London. 31 years later, in 1890, Oswald's wife Lily had been in labor, giving birth to their children. They were going to have twins, Edwin and Enoch. However, after delivering Edwin, she soon fell unconscious and eventually died before giving birth to Enoch, leaving Oswald to tend to the children alone without his love. Lily's funeral would be soon held on September the 26th. 8 years later, Oswald had become greatly invested in his new machines for his factory. However, he was now facing a new type of grief, financial ruin. Here he began to fear that the bailiffs would come to repossess his home. On the 29th of November of the same year, Oswald had read Daniel's diaries of his travels and decides to travel to the west to find the Temple of the Stone Moon in America. Taking his children abroad at the ages of 8, Oswald arrives in Mexico the following year in February, which he was then led to the temple by a local. 3 days later, on the 17th of February, Oswald finds the temple the tales spoke about and begins to journey inside the ruins. However, Oswald had been uninitiated in the mystical arts, so much so that when he held the orb in his hands, the magical artifact had split in half, which did more than meets the eye. It had in fact done something terrible to Oswald to match its own form, splitting his soul in two as well. However, this came with a gift too, as the orb pieces had brought visions to Oswald of the oncoming war in the 20th century. There he foresaw his 2 children at the ages of 24 being thrusted into the events of the First World War at the Battle of the Somme. Truly heartbroken and devastated by the revelation, and with madness seeping out of the broken orb, he finds his children, holding them in his arms, much like the orb pieces, holding them tight, tighter than he ever had before, when he brutally murders them in a sort of mercy to prevent them from seeing the horrors of war. He justified the act as mercy to prevent them from being slain at the battle, that he didn't want the boys to have to endure their fates like so many would. This event caused Oswald to change over time, making him detest humanity, to hate the world he lived in. He then sought a new world, to remake it, and to stop the future wars before they could begin. He would then become inspired by the evidence of human sacrifice seen on the temple walls, and to create a mechanized form of it. Traveling back to England, Oswald had become stricken by a fever. Becoming terribly ill, Oswald begins to dream like never before, dreaming of one great machine. On the 15th of March, Oswald returns to London with his children beside him, or what had been left of them, and that of the shattered orb. He brought his children's skulls to the garden to be buried, and he placed the 2 pieces of the orb on the mantelpiece. At the end of April, Oswald receives a strange crate that had been imported to him, with the contents containing a gatherer from Brennenburg. The appearance truly fascinated him when he sees the deformed monster, seeing it as inspiration into creating his own twist on the creature, leading him into the development of the man-pigs. By this time, the construction of the great machine had long since started, and Oswald had a plan to create a mechanized god that would save humanity from their chaotic and destructive ways. In order to further prevent the oncoming storm of World War I, he would do this by feeding people to it in a mass human sacrifice. On the 15th of July, Oswald creates Compound X to fuse human DNA with that of the pigs, in combination with Brennenburg infusion vitae and organ monad dispersal fluid. By this time, however, Oswald's health begins to deteriorate, even more so as the time progresses. By the 1st of August, several of the experiments escape their holding cells, with them fleeing into the sewers. With no other choice, Oswald makes a difficult decision, but to seal the sewers in order to prevent their further escape into the London streets. 19 days later, Oswald successfully creates several man-pigs by using patients from Bethlehem Royal Hospital, and once ready, he sends them out into the streets of London to kidnap people in the dead of the night, to feed them to his machine. Between the 21st of August and the 30th of November, Oswald continues the construction of the machine to the point where it's nearly fully automated and the process finished. To get the construction finished even faster, Oswald resorts to using child labor in clearing the large pipes, emancipating from the machine. Oswald then begins collecting specific people to be fed to the machine and organizing their deaths very specifically. With the rich, he organizes a very expensive dinner to be served with wine that had been spiked with a poisonous tonic. With the poor, however, he had created St. Dunstan's Church, to which Oswald had been praised heavily for this act of charity. However, what the public did not know was that this was all a trap for them, to be led by the hand down under the altar through a secret passage that led straight to their dooms. This event would lead into a greater toll than that of Alexander the Baron of Brennenburg had been able to accomplish, with hundreds of people being stuffed down the maw of the machine. The machine at this point is nearing completion. All that had been left was to give it some of Oswald's blood, which sends the other half of his soul into the cold and unrelenting machine, making it sentient. This half of the soul had been responsible for the murder of his children and the hatred he felt towards others. Now the machine's identity had been revealed as the engineer. The 1st of December is when Oswald had finally broken free from the darker alter ego he had been all this time. He begins to realize now what he has become. He might have ridden himself of the darker one. However, the sickness he contracted from Mexico had still been festering inside of him, and it had been getting much worse now. On the 20th of December, the members of the Rifle Club all begin to grow suspicious of the recent activities along with the ministry, friends and associates of Mandus. There they employ an investigator called Professor A to get to the bottom of this. However, after the investigator pushed and prodded against Oswald in their conversations, Oswald had enough of these tiresome interrogations and led the man to the machine before giving the engineer a treat. Soon all of the past events began to haunt Oswald as he is stricken by guilt, regret, and a desire for redemption. There he begins to sabotage all of his work on the machine, barricading his mansion before locking himself away in his quarters before the illness becomes too much and he passes out, leading into the events of Amnesia, a machine for pigs. Awakening from his slumber, Oswald's illness has resulted in a temporary case of amnesia, when all of a sudden he can hear his children, which motivates him out of the bed and to follow their voices. Soon he had been contacted by a mysterious man over the phone who tells him that his children need his help, that they are trapped deep below the surface of London. The only way to save them is to drain the floodwaters and to reactivate the machine, which had been easier said than done, as the man-pigs would see to it that they killed anyone on sight that dared to look at their deformed sight. Against all the odds, the frail man had succeeded in his plight, but once the machine is reactivated, he cannot believe that he had in fact been deceived into believing his children had still been alive. The engineer then releases the man-pigs into the streets of London to serve its beckon to pull more and more humans into the sewers and down the machine's gullet.
Now, Madness, set them free. Set them all free. I live. I breathe again. I rise. I will rise to bleach the sky and still the water. I will spin the world wheel and set the future upon the path to redemption.
Where are my children? You promised me my children!
My time is come. More pig. More pig!
Boys, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
Once reaching the surface, Oswald can see the streets of London are in complete disarray, with pigmen of various sizes chasing people out of their homes and into the dark and gloomy streets, all to be sacrificed in the name of the engineer. Now having regained his memories, Oswald sets out to complete his goals, not only to sabotage the machine, but to destroy it altogether. His travels take him down into the Tesla, where the machine is being powered from, and after escaping an electrifying abomination, he finds the heart of the machine, being the power it creates to sustain its function. Oswald destroys the heart, which causes him to be electrocuted as well, knocking him out, to which he reawakens in the temple where it all began, and when he turns around he can see a cryotube. Upon examination, Oswald becomes distracted by the voices of his children, leading him deeper into the tunnel with the presence of his children around every nook and cranny of the dusty environment. With every step, the weight of the guilt becomes unbearable, with his children's ghosts haunting him every step of the way back to the machine. Once there, the other half of his soul, the engineer, begs Oswald not to kill him, But Oswald didn't care to listen to the sadistic machine he had created. He walks until seeing a chair at the very end. As Oswald sits there in the chair, he can see the bodies of his children hanging from the walls, to which he then activates the device to do as his darker half had said before of what the pigmen will do to the humans. They will eat them, Mandus. They will make pigs of you all, and they will bury their snouts into your ribs, and they will... And just like that, as some sort of premonition, the device plunges deep into Oswald's chest and rips out his beating heart, just like the Mayans had done all those years ago, with the life force of the engineer being linked to Oswald. Once he dies, so does the engineer, and thus the machine becomes a soulless, cold object once again, never to be used again. And so the world moves on. However, will the world move into a brighter or far darker territory in the future? Moving into the 20th century, into the world that Oswald had seen in his time of pure madness, the war he tried to prevent was on the horizon. Henry Clement and Tassie Trinon had been born near the end of the 19th century. In 1911, the Al-Mamari fort had been occupied by the French Foreign Legion. Eventually, the events that take place in the real world occurs, leading into 1914, when the First World War breaks out between the several great and powerful nations of the world. In between 1914 and 1916, Henry Clement's regiment had been deployed at the bunker during the war, which was unfortunate for them. By the 2nd of April 1916, J. Renoir begins to write to Sergeant Renard on his criticisms of expanding the bunker deeper and how the men would suffer in these conditions on the Western Front, calling this task of being idiotic, with scared and foolhardy men having to carry it out, stating that the war was minimalistic in comparison. Fearing the consequences of his feelings on the matter, he would ask for confidentiality between the two of them, as he would be court-martialed for this type of behavior. On the 10th of April, Soldat Boisrond writes on the dangers of dealing with the generator's fuel, specifically when the men would light fires or smoke near the canisters, instructing those on how to properly store such liquids and how to dispose of used fuel safely. He then attaches the letter to a post in the generator room for others to see. Soldat Toussaint also writes a poem in his spare time called We Whirl the World. The 30th of April, Alex Neuer begins to write in his journal about being informed by the engineering team on their discovery of ancient Roman tunnels next to the position of the bunker. The 5th of May, Johannes Nicolai writes to his dearly beloved wife on the deteriorating situation of the bunker, how he woke up to a strange howling or crying off in the distance. Johannes had investigated into the strange occurrence. When he is led to the Roman tunnels, he begins to hear something running straight at him through the pitch black darkness, where Toussaint had emerged from the black fog of the tunnel system. He tells Johannes that he too was awoken by the same sounds echoing through the bunker. Feeling that something was off, he also began searching for answers, and then tells Johannes that he saw something down there. But then, the sounds began to distance from the pair and finally disappeared altogether. When questioned by what he saw, Toussaint couldn't, as the mere sight of the creatures lurking down there had been so horrifying, so terrible, that it shocked him to the core and traumatized him. On the 9th of May, Alex Neuer is given ancient textures by one of the officers in the bunker. 2 days later, one of Neuer's friends, Ackerman, had succumbed to his wounds and perishes. Neuer writes on the death of his friend and wishes him safe passage to heaven, to be delivered from the evil of this war. To distract him from the grief circulating through his mind, he combs through the ancient texts, He finds that they are not Roman at all. He then theorizes that the scrolls are in Latin origin and not in Roman culture. He further concludes that the texts speak in a superstitious or religious nature, mentioning a repeated phrase over and over to cross into the darkness and beyond, and the word sight. On the 13th of May, Alex Neuer confirms that the texts are of a religious nature, that they speak on having found the secret to immortality. The scrolls talk about a different world to their own, a other world that had been ruled by a mysterious and dark entity. The scroll describes the world to be full of hellish creatures with internal suffering being heard through the air itself. This would lead Neuer to allege that the description sounds a lot like the pagan hell, and mentions a substance that is required to grant immortality. The following day, Gaspar Larue is assigned to assist the engineers in mapping out the tunnels. Soon, however, he reports on seeing a strange liquid as he travels, before suddenly being thrusted into another plane of existence, a new world that seems alien in design. The world had been a darkened one, with him being beckoned by a great light among the malformed shadows that lingered there. However, once he blinked, he was back inside the Roman tunnels. The memory of the moment makes him feel sick to his stomach, and that it has begun to haunt him. He then begs to be put on medical leave. Neuer is shocked to hear that even though he had been the only one to read the ancient textures found in the scrolls, there were those who could say they had witnessed things that were described in the scrolls, yet they hadn't read them yet. On the 15th of May, Sergeant Stefan Gerbert bears a report from Neuer, with it stating that the Romans had used the ancient grounds for blood rituals, horrifying and gruesome torture, along with combat, and that there had been an arena suspended above a great dark pit, and if anyone fell from the platform, they would fall into a deep, screaming pit of pure darkness. However, the sergeant had mocked Neuer and recommended to put him on surveillance for the foreseeable future. The next day, Toussaint writes about the textures that Neuer has been telling everyone about, mentioning that he doesn't know of the scrolls as he has been having dreams about what is to be described in them from what he has heard. He saw in his dream himself drinking a liquid that gives him lust for that of sex, flesh, and most of all, blood. He then sees himself serving the same master as a multitude of figures for a place in her own unending kingdom, referring the act of service to this master as immortality, and then refers to a deep burning desire to return to this dream, to return to that world, even as dark and twisted as they may be, comparing the dreams to the war, calling the battles and horrors he bore witness to mere child's play. On the 18th of May, Larue informs Sergeant Renard that Neuer has been spreading rumors about the pagan rituals and mystic arts, stating that the men have been seeing ghosts, demons, and fairies. Renard reprimands Neuer for this, and the excavation continues as planned. Neuer and the other men, Nicolai, Faber, Welbeck, and others start to develop paranoia, having vivid nightmares or seductive voices among them in the darkness, but dare not to speak up in fear of punishment. 2 days further into this unsettling prelude, Soldat Chenard writes to Foreman Stafford, where he mentions the rats have begun to grow through some changes since they had opened up the Roman tunnels. The rats have become disfigured, some with bones piercing through their skin and fur, a change to their color, as if they had been rolling around in a pool of crimson blood that came with an aggressive rage. Later through the day, a raid sweeps through the bunker that lasts for 3 days. On the 25th of May, the sounds return, and this time they are even louder and worse than before, that begin to drive the men crazy. Neuer, after having dreams of pain and ecstasy, returns to the Roman tunnels in order to end things for the sake of his fellow soldiers. However, something inside the tunnels causes Neuer to begin screaming, and the soldiers rushed through the tunnels in order to rescue him. Ozane writes about this event, that Neuer had been screaming for hours. After being rescued and tied to a stretcher, he continued to scream all the way until only a raspy sound could escape his lungs. Whatever he must have seen down there must have been truly terrifying. Ozane talks to Faber, telling him that the rest of the men have seen things, and asks what is to be done about it. On the 28th of May, Faber sees how the men have been treated, and judging on their situation begins to plot a sabotage with the rest of the men in order to stop the operation, and even begins to write about these events in his journal. The next day, Dr. Josinski sees that the rats have continued to change from their standard behavior and appearance, becoming terrifyingly aggressive, growing even larger to the size of cats. He has seen them eat corpses of the deceased soldiers, and even ones that had rushed to the wounded men, killing them and devouring them. A truly nasty way to go. The good doctor reports that they should begin cremating the bodies, as the rats won't eat burnt flesh. Moving into the second day of June, Toussaint, Gaspar, Johannes, Nicolet, Jean Renoy, and Ozane begin preparations to sabotage the excavations by destroying the entrance with the use of explosives. The following day, Commandant Fournier orders the men to reinforce security in the arsenal, where he vows to punish those involved with their sabotage. The 4th of June, Toussaint writes in his journal that he is able to see what others cannot, due to the others not possessing the right eyes for the task. He further claims that he bore witness to a world of seducing secrets. He begged God to spare him, to stop these intrusions into his mind, to which he, after some time, spirals out of control and rips his own eyes from their sockets. 2 days after this horrific event takes place, Fournier orders Sergeant Renard to further into his investigation of the sabotage, believing these to be connected to the strange rumors of ghosts and ghouls in the tunnels. Just 3 days later, on the 9th of June, the saboteurs confess to their crimes, except for Toussaint, who is still missing at this time, and many had presumed that his death had a play in his absence. The men claimed that the sabotage was to save the men from the forces of hell, and stated that their beliefs on the haunted and cursed nature of the Roman tunnels. This leads into a further assessment being made, and they find that some areas have become flooded and inaccessible, leading to the tunnel operations being abandoned until the foreseeable future. On the 11th of June, security becomes increased throughout the bunker, and the door to communications becomes locked from the other soldiers. Sergeant Renard wishes to court-martial the saboteurs for their work, and begins writing to Major Sergeant Delphi for permission to carry out this act. However, Delphi and Renard both plan to throw the saboteurs into one of the pits and let them die a terrible and agonized death. 3 days later, the sounds from the Roman tunnels cease for the time being, while Faber is cut between two sides, feeling guilt over his fellow saboteurs, suffering and torture, yet none had turned him in out of undying loyalty. However, if he was to make his way back to the bunker, certain death would be awaiting him. On the 15th of June, Fournier orders a request for a resupply of the bunker's wine cellar, as the wine supplies are getting low, but they soon receive 2 crates out of the 10 requested. On the 30th of June, 20 or more German soldiers had been captured and taken down into the prison cells of the bunker, where they are later taken to a camp outside, all except one prisoner, 73014, who had ripped off his rank and insignia in a bid to save his own life. However, he unfortunately had made a terrible gambit, especially when it came to the 4th of July, when Renard seeks to aggressively interrogate all of the prisoners. However, the last one claimed to be a normal soldier, that he didn't know of the Second Army's plans. However, Renard doesn't buy it and goes through with the interrogation anyway. On the 8th of July, in the mid-afternoon, Rebirth requests a scout for a routine patrol. The sergeant requests either Augustine Lambert or Henry Clement to head into the mission, where he suspects one of them to be a mutineer. The two men decide to settle their dispute with a friendly game of chance. However, Clement uses a sleight of hand trick to win the game, to which he justifies to himself as Lambert had used his drinking flask as a makeshift toilet, along with putting lice in his bed, and some incident with a barmaid. In Clement's mind, cheating the game would make them even. Nearing midnight, the Germans had appeared from the smoke and shadows of the cold night and began to rain hell down on the soldiers when they begin bombing shells onto the battlefields surrounding the bunker. In the very early hours of the following morning, Henry wakes up from his slumber. However, he soon sees that Lambert is nowhere to be found. When asking around for Lambert, Dax soon tells Henry that he hadn't returned from his scouting mission, and the shelling from the Germans continues to rain hellfire across the battlefield. Later in the morning, Henry nervously awaits for Lambert's return, and with no word on Lambert, Henry begins to fear the worst, that Lambert had been killed in action, blown up into pieces by the rain of the German army. Through the rest of the morning, Henry is racked with absolute agonizing guilt for what he had done to Lambert. Even when presented with food, something that most would never turn down in these times, Henry refused to eat out of the shock he felt. At dusk, Henry still has no word on Lambert's whereabouts, to which the sergeant just shrugs it off. Henry falls into a darkened depression about him. Noticing the men drinking and partying in the bunker, he starts becoming paranoid, thinking of the consequences that would come if they found out the truth of what he had done. During the night, however, Henry tosses and turns in bed. He can't help but feel compelled to do something, motivated by his guilt and deep appreciation for his friend, to go against orders and to find Lambert, or at least what's left of him. Henry moves out into the fields of no man's land. In the beginning of his search, all hope seemed to have faded in the matter of the first hour, but then upon coming up to a large crater site, he sees a man down there and soon identifies him to be Augustine Lambert. The man, so thirsty from his mission, is left with no choice but to drink the waters from the pool next to him. However, little did the pair know that these waters were not natural, or at least wasn't from this world, but another. After pouring Lambert out of the crater, the pair make their journey back home, back to their new home, the bunker. However, as fate would have it, they are soon spotted by a German outpost that begins to bombard the two men with explosives and bullets. Henry gets hit by one of these bullets whizzing past, and if that wasn't bad enough, he ends up getting knocked back by a nearby explosion, which causes a major head injury, and he is made comatose. In the early hours of the day, the soldiers are shocked to see Lambert alive, after surviving in the wilderness for the last day, especially with the Germans scanning the battleground with their searchlights all over the place. Henry at this time is admitted to the infirmary, and the medics tend to him. Once he had been brought back to the world of the living, however, he seems to have suffered a case of amnesia, having no recollection of the recent events, not remembering even his own name, like the information had just fallen out of his head when he fell. Dr. Jawinski, however, speculated that if Henry's case doesn't improve soon, that they should admit him to St. Intine for neurological tests. After getting Lambert's report of the recent events, Jobert is shocked that the crater that Lambert fell into was actually connected to the Roman tunnels, and that if it wasn't for the Germans' shellings, then they would never have known about this new entrance to the ruins. Jobert then writes out a recommendation that the area be surveyed to see if it could be of any use to them. The 12th of July, Lambert visits Henry and thinks on the twist of fate that led the pair to this place, where he had been completely fine, but Henry was lying in the infirmary with a major head injury riddled with amnesia. Lambert thinks of the companion he left behind, a rabbit toy that he had bought for his son. Now he had lost it in the crater. The mere thought of a toy being battered by the harsh weather made Lambert feel hopeless. However, something that Lambert didn't know was that the water he drank began to make certain changes to his anatomy at a slow pace. However, the negative emotions he felt at that moment would speed the process up. During the afternoon, Henry regains consciousness, but this time can't remember anything as he is more confused as to where he is. On the other hand, however, Lambert remarks in feeling good with each passing moment. He can feel his body getting stronger and stronger, as if his body and soul have found renewed purpose. During the night, however, Lambert goes to the chapel and begins to pray. No matter what he does though, he doesn't feel tired like the other men. This brings Lambert back to the crater, and then admits that something when drinking the water he did feel something, a slight itch at the back of his mind, like a set of instructions that he called a bloody purpose, higher than any of man's wars. Throughout the night, Faber can hear a set of howls echoing through the bunker. Francois tries to find the source, but finds that he cannot. Like the origin moves whenever he does. The men all start believing it must be connected with the ancient Roman tunnels, but again don't speak up as to not be punished. Some of the men, however, couldn't contain themselves, as even with the tunnels being sealed, they could hear something howling in the barracks with them, which didn't make any sense, and those men were to be court-martialed for this. The following day, on the 13th of July, Renard is commanded by Major Blanchette to oversee the night security personally, as he has been hearing something or someone pacing through the halls. Fearing sabotage, he gives Renard permission to do whatever was absolutely necessary as to prevent another incident. Lambert also had begun to feel some psychological changes, feeling as if his hands were bulbous and didn't belong to him. In the morning of the 14th of July, Gerbert remarks that he had heard some strange scratching and pacing in the halls the previous night, but then writes it off as Renard being drunk, to which he then decides to confront him. However, at this time, Renard had been found dead, which, judging by the multiple lacerations, the chest cavity being torn to shreds, the rib cage being shattered with every rib broken, and his skull being cracked open, that could only result if there was multiple blunt force traumas applied here. This spelt out only one case for this discovery: murder. The men are left horrified by the recent discovery. Fournier begins to round all the men up. Interrogations begin that turn into terrorizing the soldiers, who all claimed to be sleeping the night before. Fournier then begins to accuse their German prisoner, and Gerbert begins wishing that an enemy attack would come soon, as he would rather face the German war machine rather than this nameless dread. Soldat Chanard wrote about that incident later and claimed that everyone hated Renard, but no one could or even would take care of him in this way. The blood, the body, the gore, they could tell that this had been similar to what wild animals could have been capable of. Lambert begins to dream of countless cruel eyes falling upon him, to where he pleads to feel more and more of their pain. On the 16th of July, Faber begins to write in his journal that there is a demon from hell among them, and that for his court-martialed brethren, he shall end it once and for all, bearing a revolver in his hand. At this time, while Tremblay was with Boisrond and Faber in the mess hall, a creature began to ambush them, to which Faber begins to shoot at it, forcing it to retreat back into the shadows. But then as Faber checked to see if it had fully disappeared, the creature pulled him into the hole in the wall as he prayed and begged for salvation. Unfortunately, there was no salvation or godly intervention here in this nightmare. On the 18th of July, Soldat Chenard bears witness to the creature's disfigured and greatly disturbing face, but notices on how it seems familiar to him somehow. Unknown to everyone in the bunker, the stalker in the shadows, or the beast, had been in fact Lambert all along, with the waters he drank, transforming him into a horrific beast that now crawled through the walls of the bunker and murdered anyone who gets in his way, which leads into the final part of the transformation, with Lambert losing what little of humanity he had left. On the 19th of July, the bunker's soldiers were getting picked off one group at a time, and even in some cases, one by one, of the lone soldiers had been pulled into the walls to await their fate, and being mutilated alive by this new demonic beast. After realizing that the beast within the walls could hear their movements, Chennard quietly crawls into a hole while holding his breath and wishing that the beast leaves. The bunker throughout the next 2 days transforms from a sprawling outpost to a quiet tomb, devoid of the drinking, partying and laughing soldiers that had once been there. Now all that had been were terrified men, holding on for dear life, wishing and hoping that whatever this monstrosity was, hunting them down, would just give up the hunt and leave to get blasted by the German war machine into many pieces. On the 20th of July, Jobert and Fournier cowered against the oppressive monster that could be lurking within the walls near to them, around the corners of the hallways, or even could be looking right at them now. They soon decide to seal the creature where it belongs in this tomb by rigging the entrance to the bunker with explosives, and once on the other side, they detonated it, sealing not just the beast but all the other souls trapped inside to contend with hell itself, dragging us kicking and screaming into the events of Amnesia The Bunker. On the 21st of July, Soldat Boisrond, despite believing he was to be the sole survivor of the attack, was hoping to find someone else alive to share in the horror of their situation. He spends his last moments leaving notes with instructions labeled on them to retrieve the Diamondite bundle in the arsenal, the detonator handle hidden within the confines of the Roman tunnels, in order to escape this nightmare hunting them. As if being psychic, Henry awakens from his comatose state, remembering very little about the recent events, except from the battles within the trenches of No Man's Land. He walks through the infirmary halls, witnessing the strange monster hunting him and the other soldiers killing those who try to give him advice. Following the instructions left behind by previously spoken about Boisrond, he finds whatever he could in order to brave the bunker's various locations, hallways, and corridors. While fending off the beast and the rats scattered throughout the facility, he finds other ways out of the bunker, only to be brought back to reality, with the Germans shooting at him when devising such an alternative means of escape, along with meeting those who either purposely or incidentally brought more danger to the soldier. Despite these deranged men, he would gather the items needed to escape the creature stalking him through the darkness, and finally blows a hole in the sabotage, leading him to the arena where Henry is forced to do battle with the one that had been hunting him all that time. Where two things can happen here. Henry can either run away from the beast and escape using his ingenuity, leading the beast out into the open to the fields of No Man's Land, or he can force the creature to fall into the pit, never to harm another living soul, trapping it with a force of nature that lurks below them. Whichever occurs, the same outcome happens, with him falling into a pool full of corpses, bringing him out of the hell of darkness and to the horrors of the First World War, which alerts the German patrols to his presence, to which he looks up to see their flashlights coming over the horizon of the hill, and he can hear the blow whistles, which would be an entirely new beast to conquer. 2 years after the events of the bunker, in 1918, Germany had signed an armistice, which had been an agreement to stop the fighting. 4 years of a bloody war, lives lost, all to lead back to peace times. However, not all lives had been victim to the war, but due to the dark secrets of those who lived before. However, soon, one would stumble to the land of before, within the events of Amnesia Rebirth. "11 years later, the Al-Mamaru fort had still been occupied by the French Foreign Legion, who began to excavate the cistern of the fortress. However, during this operation, the men unintentionally alerted a number of ghouls lurking nearby, which leads into a similar fate to those that lost their souls to the bunker, with ghouls running rampant throughout the fortress, but this time, no one got out alive, with each of the men being picked off one by one. The fortress after this event would be left as a soulless tomb, with only the ghouls inhabiting it, which would stay the same until 8 years later. 4 years into the future, in 1933, Tassie and Salim get married while she had been pregnant, and later in this year she gives birth to Elise. The two would be overjoyed to see this expanse to their family. However, this would not last as long, as when she turns 3 years old, Elise would be diagnosed with an unknown disease, becoming a parallel to the story of Atua and Tahina, except unlike their story, the disease this time wins, taking the life of Elise. Despite this tragic moment of their life, they refused to allow it to destroy them. Over the years, Tassie and Salim had been approached by a man known as Hank Mitchell, which had been a long-time friend of theirs, who made an offer to employ them to accompany an expedition to a French Sudan to refit the Jaka Sanulama gold mine. They accepted the job offer, and as they were coming up to the date of the expedition, Tassie would find that she had fallen pregnant once again. After telling Salim this, the two agreed that it would be better not to go through with the expedition, considering her new condition. However, in March 1937, Tassie and Salim flew from the Le Bourget airport in Paris and met in Algiers with the rest of the team to make their final preparations. Allowing these preparations also allowed Tassie to get to know the people she would be working with throughout the expedition. However, after flying out on the plane, the Cassandra, for some reason though, the plane loses control while flying over the Algerian desert, which causes it to crash into the sandy dunes. After assessing the team, they all began to evacuate the plane and sought refuge in the nearby caves, which had been in close proximity to the tomb of Tin Hannon. After some talks, the members of the team that could would leave to try and find help from the nearby settlements of the desert, while the injured party would stay inside the caves to rest and await for help to arrive. The members of the team who chose to seek out help from the nearby settlements soon came to the Al-Mamaru fort. Unfortunately, once they gained entry, they soon found the remains of the French Foreign Legion and the ghouls that led to some being torn apart and others forced to run for their lives. Fortunately, they had soon come to an oasis in the center of the desert and then came into contact with the spectral form of Tahana, who leads them to the Imperial Tower and tried to seduce the group with the offer of salvation. All they needed to give in order to save their group would be the baby of Tassie and Salim. Tassie, who had been with the group, rightfully refused the offer. The Empress would then implore the group to drink the waters from her fountain, telling them that it would restore them, which she would be correct. It would even make them stronger, but like what happened to Lambert in the First World War, it would turn them into unstoppable monsters. Unfortunately, the crew didn't suspect anything and drank from the fountain, drinking the contaminated waters that would soon transform them into harvesters. Soon after this event, the crew began to lose control, and the effects of the poisoned waters became apparent when they began to mutate, losing their humanity. The crew all run in different directions, leading to Hank becoming trapped within the tower, Leon becoming trapped in the hunting grounds, and Richard becoming trapped in the portal chamber. Anton and Yasmin managed to return to the village near to the Al-Mamaru fort, and Tassie ran away from Otherworld and had returned to the plane where she loses consciousness. While Tassie slept, the effects of the waters had caused her a temporary state of amnesia, where she begins to traverse and explore the surrounding areas, where she would find the other members of the crew still in the cave system. But once she had arrived, she found them to be dead, including her husband, Salim. After leaving the deeper caves, she finds the Al-Mamaru fort, and after gaining entry, she gets into contact with a familiar voice coming from the doctor in the nearby village. Once directing her to the village, she would come under attack by a ghoul, and after a lengthy chase, she only just barely escapes and moves through the cistern, where she comes into contact with the reality-bending, living nightmare, the Shadow. The Shadow gave Tassie no room for error, as it was merciless and more relentless than that of the ghouls. However, she eventually escaped it, at least for now. After going back and forth between Earth and Otherworld, she learns that Amari has the same disorders as Elise, and it has to be treated before Amari dies. Eventually, she manages to find Anton and Yasmin at the village, but then disaster strikes. Tassie begins to go into labor, which would be fine in normal circumstances, if not for Yasmin transforming into a ghoul who begins to chase Tassie, who ran not just for her life but the life of her unborn child, which proved to be an impossible task. But eventually she lost to Yasmin and gave birth to Amari with the help of Anton, who then betrays Tassie, stealing Amari from her in a bid to save his own skin. Tassie manages to catch up with him at the Imperial Tower, where she sees that he is offering Amari to Tahana. Once she catches him, she manages to kill him, but then the grueling choice is then handed to Tassie, where she either hands her baby Amari to Tahana in an act of mercy, and she is then transformed immediately into a harvester, bypassing the long and painful process with the use of her Ankari stones, or she keeps Amari with her and the two escape back to the earth, leaving Tahana behind in the ruins of Otherworld, or Tassie releases the Shadow's essence into the Vitae supply, which kills Tahana, thus ending the mass suffering in the harvesting factories at the cost of hers and Amari's life. However, the choice is yours. It always has been yours, but this time you can make it. Please tell me in the comments what you think the true endings to the Amnesia games are. And that is it for the complete history and story timeline for the Amnesia series. And I hope you all had enjoyed your stay. If you did, a like on the video would be very appreciated, along with what you thought of the history of Amnesia. Sign up to join the British Alliance today by hitting the subscribe button and ringing in the notification bell for all updates to the channel. A special thank you to the channel members for your extra mile support you bestow upon this channel, which I deeply appreciate. And if you would like to become a member, then hit that join button and I will see all of you among the cosmos, and be sure to leave this video having a good one.